looking into stroke volume a little bit further, looking into what impacts it as well as what's going on with the regulation of it. So we know that stroke volume was end diastolic volume minus end systolic volume. So let's look first off at this term preload. Now, preload is the degree of stretch of cardiac muscle. So this is pretty much what's happened before. It's also known as the Frank-Starling law for that matter. So cardiac muscle cells exhibit a length-tension relationship. So if they're open too far, they're too tight, there's an optimal point where they have the maximum amount of contraction. So at rest, cardiac muscle cells are actually shorter than their optimal length. They actually like to be a little bit longer. So at rest, not the right height, not the right length there. So at rest, just a little bit under the optimal length. A slow heartbeat exercise can increase the venous return. That means by increasing venous return, you're increasing the preload. That's more blood to start with, more stretch to start with. So exercise, increased venous return is all adding more blood in the heart before the heartbeat, before contraction. Second thing to look at is contractility. Now you might remember we've mentioned contractility before already, but contractility is the contractile strength at a given length. So if your muscle cell isn't at the optimal length, for example, at rest it was too short, it doesn't have the maximum amount of contraction at that point. So there are both positive inotropic and negative inotropic agents. Positive inotropic agents, things like an increase in calcium influx, will help with increasing contractility. Things like thyroxine, glucagon, epinephrine. Those are all going to help to increase contractility, hence positive inotropic agent. A negative inotropic agent is going to reduce contractility. Things like acidosis, increased potassium, calcium channel blockers. Not enough calcium, troponin is not moving out of the way as easily. So any of these could actually decrease the amount of actual contractility. We then have afterload. So preload, contractility, and now afterload. Afterload is the pressure the ventricle must create to actually eject the blood from the ventricle. Basically what that means is, for example, your left ventricle is going to have to generate enough pressure to push the blood into the actual aorta. Now, your blood pressure, let's say theoretically 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, even at its lowest, at 80, still has 80 millimeters of mercury of pressure in the aorta. The ventricle has to generate that much pressure to open up the aortic semilunar valve. That's why hypertension, so high blood pressure, can actually increase afterload. It increases the amount of force necessary, which that means the end systolic volume. So end systolic volume reduces stroke volume because there's more blood left over at the end because you just simply couldn't push it out because it's a higher pressure. So your reduced stroke volume means if it's not paired with any other change, you're reducing cardiac output. Now, a lot of times, if you reduce the stroke volume, you end up with a little higher heart rate to try to compensate. So your body's trying to equal out that cardiac output. So here are some different factors, kind of a little chart going through things here. So first off, you notice preload, contractility, afterload. The three main factors we've already gone through. So under preload, if you increase filling time and increase venous return, so that means either you take longer to fill, so you have more blood to start with, or more blood's coming in, but a short amount of time. That causes an increase in end diastolic volume, the amount of blood in the ventricle before contraction, which means now you have increased your stroke volume. Let's look at contractility. All of these, if you increase or raise them. So more sympathetic stimulation, strong contractions. You have thyroid hormones, strong contractions. All of this is going to decrease the end systolic volume because your contractions are harder, they're stronger, which means less blood is left in the ventricle, so you've decreased your end systolic volume. By decreasing the end systolic volume, you're increasing your stroke volume. More blood's being pumped out. All right, afterload. Increased vascular resistance or semilunar valve damage. If there's more resistance, it's harder to get the blood out there. It takes more force. That ends up increasing end systolic volume. More blood's left over after contraction. That decreases stroke volume. But now the bottom row here. If you're looking at all these for preload, decreasing, so less thyroid hormone, less calcium, you have hypoxia here, which is low oxygen. All of those are going to decrease end diastolic volume. If you decrease the end diastolic volume, so that means less blood to start with before contraction, that's going to decrease stroke volume. All right, under contractility, you have acetylcholine. We already talked about this, how it's going to actually reduce contractility. Parasympathetic system, reduce contractility. If you're reducing contractility, you're increasing end systolic volume because it can't contract as much. More blood is left over after the heartbeat. More blood left over means the stroke volume has decreased. And for afterload, you decrease vascular resistance, which means you decreased end systolic volume. If you decrease end systolic volume, you increase stroke volume because less end systolic volume means less blood is left over, more blood is pumped out, stroke volume went up. So these three factors all work together, the preload, contractility, and afterload. If one changes, a lot of times the other two end up compensating or trying to create this homeostatic balance to keep your cardiac output stable. And that's not even taking into account the heart rate. This is just dealing with stroke volume. So let's look at more a factor of what we're seeing here. Exercise. Now, if you increase exercise, you increase the skeletal muscle pumps and the respiratory pumps. We haven't really gotten to those yet because that's next unit, next chapter. But skeletal muscle pumps, think about in your legs, for example, gastrocnemius muscle, lower leg. As that contracts, it pushes on the veins. By pushing and collapsing the veins, the blood goes above or below where it's pinched. But if there's valves in place, the blood cannot go back, has to go forward. That means these skeletal muscle pumps, this contraction of skeletal muscle, is helping to bring blood back up to the heart. Respiratory pump, also helping to bring blood back to the heart. The pressure changes in your thoracic cavity help to pull that blood up. But all that together increases venous return. More venous return means your end diastolic volume, your preload, goes up. If your preload goes up, your stroke volume goes up, which means your cardiac output goes up as well, assuming no other changes. Same thing for if you lower your heart rate. Lower your heart rate, more time for the venous filling, which has the exact same process all the way through. Epinephrine, thyroxine, extra calcium, all can increase contractility. If you increase contractility, less blood is left over in the ventricle after contraction, which means stroke volume goes up, cardiac output goes up. Exercise, anxiety, fright. We're going back to the emotional and physical stressors. You have an increase in sympathetic control, which means you're increasing your heart rate. But that sympathetic control also increases contractility. So it works in both avenues here. But while all those increase sympathetic, they decrease parasympathetic control. Heart rate goes up, contractility goes up, cardiac output goes up, more blood's coming out per beat. So quite a few different factors can influence how the heart is functioning here, from preload to contractility to afterload to how exercise impacts as well.